Welcome to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast for couples who struggle with infertility and want to fulfill their dreams of becoming parents. In this podcast, you'll learn actionable strategies to deal with infertility from Dr. Michael Chapman, or Prof as he's affectionately known. Prof is the co-founder of IVF Australia and is a leading Australian infertility specialist who has helped over 3,000 couples realise their dreams of becoming parents. To access previous episodes packed with ideas, solutions and tips that actually work, head over to Dr. Chapman's IVF podcast on iTunes. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.
That first cry of a baby born after the long journey of IVF remains one of the most beautiful experiences in the world. As an obstetrician and an IVF specialist, I've had the privilege of experiencing this over many thousands of times in my long career, but I still remain moved by each baby's first cry. It signifies the end of a long journey and the beginning of a new life. This is Professor Michael Chapman, co-founder of IVF Australia and host of the IVF Journey podcast. Thanks for tuning in. To access all the previous episodes, head over to my website, www.theivfjourney.com, and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu. You'll also be able to find the various services that we provide at IVF Australia. Today we're going to talk about how we maximise our chances of getting a pregnancy by stimulating egg production. Ultimately, the IVF journey has a degree of luck associated with it. The luck is about creating an embryo which is genetically normal and able to implant in the uterus. All the evidence in natural cycles indicates that fertilization of a single egg occurs far more often, probably in 60 to 70% of cycles where women are trying to conceive, but only 15% end up with an ongoing pregnancy. And that's because only one egg is produced. There's no ability for the body to, in a human anyway, to produce multiple eggs and allow the best one to go forward. So if we go back in history to the early days of IVF, stimulation drugs weren't used and the doctors were going in to collect 1 or 2 eggs. With fertilization rates of less than 50% and the ability to culture embryos resulting in embryos in only 10 or 15% of cycles, success rates were incredibly low. The first baby born was after over 100 IVF attempts. So what doctors realised was that if they could stimulate the ovaries to produce more eggs, it would increase the chances from that one cycle of finding the lucky one that will produce the embryo that will be the baby at the end of the day. So that led to the use of pituitary hormones to override and augment the natural processes to give high egg numbers. So in 1984 came the first reports of pregnancies produced following ovarian superovulation. In those days, the drugs that were used were injections of LH and FSH derived from the urine of postmenopausal women. That sounds fairly horrendous, but that's where it came from. It was naturally available in high concentrations in postmenopausal women. The first products, in fact, were created in Italy, and the production of these hormones by filtration and concentration required thousands of gallons of urine. Just like a milk truck going to the dairy, the monasteries or the nunneries in Italy had trucks pulling up every day to collect the thousands of gallons and take them to the local pharmaceutical factory where the hormones were then distilled down to being usable for humans. They resulted, when injected, in overriding the natural processes in the ovary to only produce one egg, and we end up with multiple eggs. This was a huge step forward in the efficiency of IVF. It's always, until recently, required daily injections to provide that stimulus. There is now one product on the market worldwide which is long-acting, and one injection can last for 7 days of stimulation of the ovary. For many women, this has been a big step forward if they've had cycles, many cycles, reducing the burden for their lives of the daily injections. We have advanced on from urinary products to genetically engineered FSH, and the various pens that have now been developed, a bit like diabetic insulin pens, have again lessened the difficulties for patients going through an IVF cycle. In the 80s, patients had to attend the clinic every day to get their injections because they had to be drawn up exactly. We've moved on a long way from there. One question that I often get asked is, if we stimulate lots of eggs on a series of cycles, won't menopause come earlier because I'll have used up all my eggs? We can be reassured this is not the case, because actually what is happening in nature is that somewhere between 100 and 200 eggs a month are lost. Out of that 1 to 200 eggs in a natural cycle, one is selected by processes within the ovary that we still don't understand, but one is selected to be the prize egg that will be ovulated halfway through the menstrual cycle, potentially to produce a baby. In that selection process, the other 100 to 200 eggs are lost. They degenerate and are lost forever. That's the process that ultimately leads to the menopause, when all the eggs have gone. In an IVF cycle, the high exposure of FSH to the ovary overrides the natural suppression of those hundreds of eggs. And so what we're doing is actually rescuing eggs that would never have been useful anyway. And the data quite clearly shows that women who've been through IVF have no greater chance of an early menopause than any other woman. Pharmaceutical companies keep looking for better ways of giving FSH. At this stage, nasal sprays have been tried, tablets have been tried, but unfortunately, it seems that the optimal way, most predictable way of stimulating multiple eggs is injections of FSH. But that may change into the future. Tablets like clomiphene have been used in IVF cycles, and certainly in that scenario of polycystic ovarian syndrome, you can get multiple egg growth using clomiphene or letrozole. But the numbers are still only 2 or 3, not the 10 to 15 that we often get using FSH. So really, in terms of efficiency, the use of those drugs really is not as good as the injectables. But there is the occasional patient who doesn't want to have injections, doesn't want to be hyperstimulated, and we do go down that track. I mentioned the word hyperstimulate, and really that's the biggest problem that places a risk to a woman's health doing an IVF cycle. There have certainly been women around the world who've died in the reproductive age having been overstimulated with FSH to produce too many eggs, and the alterations in hormones have led to abnormalities in the blood vessels, blood clotting, and, as I said, in death. We try our best to avoid hyperstimulation syndrome because of that risk. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've virtually wiped out ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome if you use a different trigger injection to prepare the eggs for collection. By using something called a GnRH agonist. We stimulate a normal pituitary surge of hormones, and that seems to avoid the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Again, this is a huge advance in the safety of our IVF journey. So, I've talked a bit about the stimulation of eggs, and I hope you have a little bit more understanding of why we need to stimulate. And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu.
Thank you for listening to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast which helps couples negotiate their way through the IVF journey, all the way to parenthood. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.